The convergence of our voices is the song of our beauty. Many voices will speak here, the song woven through diverse notes. Hello, everybody, and welcome. Today I'm going to be talking with storyteller Celia Lottridge. And of course, my favorite subjects are stories and writing. And Celia is going to discuss how she came to tell the stories that she does. And she started telling stories, in the 1960s with in New York City with children. And then she moved to Toronto and began community storytelling. But now I'm just going to hand it over to Celia to continue.
Thank you, Gail. It was very interesting thinking about why I tell the stories I tell, and also why I've written the books I've written, because I've written a number of books, mainly for children of different ages. So that's what I'm going to be talking about mainly, because the whole question of why you tell the stories you tell is gotten to be quite a vital question that storytellers are having to consider, where before we just more or less found stories we liked and we told them, depending on the audience. You know, you're always looking at the audience, but now it matters it matters that you know where the stories came from, know your connection with the stories, and in some cases it depends on your audience. And I mean, it's complicated, I will say that, but you don't want to be telling stories that people feel, well, this is my story, this is the story of my culture, if you don't really know very much about the culture. And so we all have to consider this when we go out to tell stories in the community. And so that made me think, why do I tell the stories I tell? And what are my connection with stories? And what are my sources? Because, I think often in Toronto, we're thinking of people who come from a place, a culture, and they want that culture to be respected, and and they want to represent it, especially in telling stories. They don't want somebody who doesn't understand the culture to come in and feel they can tell these stories. But that's one part of this. But another part is how the storyteller or the writer feels connected to the story. And I thought, so I began thinking about this because I both, as I said, written books for children and told stories for many, many years to children and other people. So I thought, well, like, what are my sources sort of deep inside me for stories? And I realized that in this talk, I'm going to talk about three sources, and two of them are my family, because although my family doesn't have a traditional oral tradition, I mean, my family came to North America hundreds of years ago, 200 or 300 years ago, and didn't maintain an oral tradition from wherever they came from, which would have been probably England. And that's what I know, and I have no oral tradition from that part of my of me. I don't know an oral tradition, but my family told stories. My parents both told stories, and as I've thought about this, I realized their stories have been incredibly important to me. And so I'm going to talk a bit about each parent, and their traditions were, and their contribution to me were very different from each other, and then how that resulted in stories I was interested in and stories that I wrote. And so I'm going to start with my mother. My mother was born in 1906 in Urumia, Persia. her family were American missionaries who had come to that area of Persia, which is it borders on Turkey and Afghanistan, and it contains a lot of different ethnic groups, including Assyrians and Nestorians, people who, ancient Christian sects, and Kurds. There were many Kurds. So it was a mix of people. And the missionaries were mainly working with people that were Christian. They weren't converting people into Christianity. But my feeling is they wanted them to be better organized. Well, they wanted them to have a better life. They were mostly extremely poor and living in remote villages, but they also had a sort of, I consider it to be a kind of Presbyterian image of, the kind of organization and commitment to community and things that they thought would be good for them in their communities. Well, my great-grandfather went to be a missionary. My grandfather was a missionary. And so my mother was born not just, they didn't just light in Urumia, they had already lived there for decades before my mother arrived. So the whole family had a very real connection to that whole part of Persia, which is what it was called at the time. And so my mother, when I was a little girl, I would say to my mother, "Tell me about when you were a little girl in Persia." And she would tell me stories about things like fruit being, drying fruit on the roof and being careful if you were sneaking a piece of fruit, that it was actually fruit and not a hot pepper. And also the whole process of how bread was made, starting with cleaning the wheat on the roof so the husk would fly away. And she told little, going into the umbar, which was the storeroom for food, and you had to go with your mother because you had to go down steep steps, and there was a heavy bar on the door, and then all the things that were in the umbar. I mean, when I was a little girl, I loved hearing these stories about how my mother lived in such a different world when she was a little girl. And that world for my mother came to an end, and in many ways it came to an end during the First World War, when that part of Persia was neutral, but they were on the border of the Ottoman Empire. So people who wanted something were coming over to the border, stealing things, raiding villages and things like that. And also war tends to bring out the worst in people. And so groups that had managed to get together for, who knows, hundreds of centuries, suddenly weren't in conflict. So it was a very dangerous place. And my grandmother, there was also a typhus epidemic, and my grandmother died. So my mother's mother died when my mother was 8. And after my grandmother died, my grandfather arranged a way to bring his children up to America to live with their mother's sisters and brothers, going through Russia. So, I mean, that's another story, when traveling through Russia in 1915, which is when this was, and being in St. Petersburg in 1915. Anyway, so that ended my mother's Persian life, but it didn't end her stories or her thinking about it. And the other thing that my mother brought from her experience as a child was food, because we always ate like Persian rice. We ate stuffed vine leaves. Our best celebration food was lamb. And my mother wished she could bake bread the way they did in the mission, but you just can't do it in a regular gas oven. So we sort of ate Persian food and listened to my mother's stories. So that was part of me. It really was. So that's one part. And in terms of the stories, I could always retell my mother's stories of when she was a little girl. I didn't feel I didn't know any folk tales from the people that she grew up with, but I began to know the history quite a bit. And then just to go forward in time a bit, after my grandfather had brought his little daughters back, or not back, but to America, he went back, and he was somebody who'd grown up there, who knew several of the languages, was trusted by many people. And so he got a kind of semi-official role given to him, and trying to, well, keep groups separate from each other so they wouldn't kill each other and things like that. And in the end, many people had to flee, and he decided he had to go with them because they needed somebody who could be organized and represent them in some way. But he got cholera on the way and he died. So my grandfather was no longer there. Nobody in my family was there. But my Aunt Susan, who was his oldest daughter, older than my mother, she, to me, I'll just make a really long story, but she went to Persia after the war, when the Middle East had millions of refugees. I think if we're in the European side of the world, we don't even remember this about World War I, how many people were displaced, and including the people of Urumia. Anyway, so there was an orphanage in Hamadan, which is in Persia, and they needed a director, and my Aunt Susan applied, and she became the director of that orphanage. And I wrote, and knowing her story and finding documents about it and reading about her, I wrote a novel called Home is Beyond the Mountains, there, about, which is really, it's really about children, two girls who are part of the exodus of people who ran away, who end up in a refugee encampment, and eventually in this orphanage run by this woman named Susan Shedd. And then from Susan's, what I know about her, I wrote this novel then is about how she got these children back to where they came from. That's why it's called Home is Beyond the Mountains. So that story, not only the narrative, but my understanding of the people who had to flee, comes from my mother's experiences, from what she told us, and as well as from documents. So that's a source for me of this novel, but also stories that I tell. So that is one part of my mother's legacy. There's other parts that I won't go into because it's too many. But she, I think one of the reasons my mother was so effective in telling these stories is that she always said, "I'm not a storyteller. Your father is the storyteller." And to her, she was just telling us about what had happened, and so it had this kind of matter-of-fact quality that made you totally believe it. She wasn't heightening anything. She was telling us what happened. So that is one of my foundational sources, I would say. Then to go to my father's family, they came from England and settled in North America sometime in the probably 1800s, and they were farmers, at least as far as I know. I don't know that much about them, but they ended up in Iowa, which is where my father was born. And my grandfather had grown up on a farm, but he really wanted to be a businessman. But he, around the time of the First World War, there was a kind of a depression in America, and he lost his job. Anyway, he ended up buying land in Alberta, which I'm sure if you are Canadian, you might think, was that really the very best idea? But that's what he did. And so the result is that my father, at the age of 12, went with his father to Alberta to build a house and start a farm, and then the rest of the family would come. And so my father used to tell us stories about that time in Alberta, and especially about his horse. He had a horse that he just loved, that actually everybody loved him. His name was King, and I have some photographs of King. I mean, he was one of those horses that was beloved. And but he also told about hunting and about their neighbors who plowed with oxen. Unlike my mother, who just told us what she knew, my dad was a storyteller. And I think maybe one thing that inspired me to be a storyteller is I remember him sitting at a long table with colleagues and, friends and stuff. And 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 when he said about something, he said, well, I could tell you a story about that. Everybody stopped talking, they stopped eating, and they all turned to look at my father because they wanted to hear the story. And he just had a way of telling shaggy dog stories so that people wanted to hear the story. And so we were very lucky because he told the story often when we were on car trips. And, in those days, all you could do is turn on the radio if you're in a car. So my dad would tell us stories about the farm in Iowa. And there were, I think in the case of both of my parents, there was real hardship involved in both of their cases. And my father's case, the farm was, I mean, some people who took those farms are still there. I mean, not everybody left, but it's not easy land to farm. And then my father got osteomyelitis, which is a bone infection, when he was 15. And so he had a very hard time with pain and sickness, but that's not what he told the stories about. He told about other things. So anyway, I grew up with this image of the farm. And so in the end, I wrote two books. One of them just fell on the floor, but this is one. The second one, I don't know where to put this. Wings to Fly. I wrote one called Home. No, what's it called? Anyway, I wrote one about that focuses on a boy who is real model on my father, and has to do with building the farm because he went with his father to build the house, and then the rest of the family came later. And then later on, his sister Lucille, who stayed in Alberta, went to the University of Alberta and lived there the rest of her life. I was visiting and I said, can you tell me anything about the farm? And so she told me some really neat things, one of several of whom were about her mother, my grandmother, who died before I was born. And I had not heard a lot about her, except she was wonderful. Everybody loved her, but they didn't tell me any details about her. But Lucille, my Aunt Lucille, she told me a couple of things about that her mother did, that then sort of I used them in this book, which has the experience of being a teacher, because Lucille taught for one summer in order to earn money to go to the university. And just one thing was that she got there, she got the school, it was very exciting, she was all ready, and it turned out the children all spoke German. She did not speak German. And so nobody had mentioned this to her. And but luckily there was an organ in the school because it was also a church, and she was very good at music, and the children loved music. So she was able to, teach for the summer. And then at the end of the summer, part of the story is that the school board chair told her he couldn't pay her, that people hadn't paid their taxes and he didn't have any money. And my grandmother said, put on your best hat, we are going to go talk to that man. And she got paid. So that's one of the stories in here. But so you see, I come from an oral tradition, even though I didn't know it until I thought about it, thanks to Gail. Now, shall I just continue? Okay.
Yeah. Or
Is
if you'd like to talk about how you went to Russia and started with Russian stories, that would be great.
That's right. Yeah. So I was living in New York, as Gail said. I was living there because I had married a man who was well, no, I went there myself to go to library school, and then I got married, and my husband came to go to Columbia to get a degree in Russian, and he got it accepted on an exchange between the American government and the Canadian government and the Soviet government that exchanged scholars. So he would go to the University of Moscow, and then somebody from there would come to Columbia. And a part of the treaty, this was all on a treaty, so you had to follow the treaty. Spouses were allowed to come. The British had a similar exchange, but they did not allow spouses for some reason. So the poor British students who were there had no spouses with them, but the Americans and the Canadians did. So I got to go to Russia, if you want to put it that way. I'll say I had the opportunity to go to Moscow, where my husband would be at the University of Moscow for 9 months. This was in 65. And so it was exciting, and we went. And the thing was, I didn't speak any Russian. My husband spoke excellent Russian, and that allowed him, people just trusted him because he spoke good Russian. Um, um, and I was just sort of this person beside him. But I had two problems. One, I didn't speak Russian, and it's not that I don't drink, but if I drink, I really have to be careful not to drink much, because mainly alcohol puts me to sleep. Well, Russians, I mean, then drink a lot, and so your social life tends to be tended to be take place around tables in somebody's room where you were drinking vodka and maybe eating some bread or something. And I just couldn't do that, which meant, well, people basically pitied me. Poor Celia, she can't handle the vodka. Anyway, so that was one factor. The other factor to me was that my husband, he was there on an exchange, a scholarly exchange. He had to go to the university every day and do scholarly work. So that left me in Moscow, not speaking Russian, figuring out what to do. And I decided I would just go to the downtown part of Moscow, around the Kremlin area, and just take walks and see what I could see. And you had to be careful, because you couldn't go to any place that had any military installations, no barracks or anything, and also no highly industrial area. And you couldn't really tell ahead of time where these places were, so you just had to watch and be sure there weren't military things, because the big thing was, if I did something that got me arrested, let's say, what would happen is we would both be expelled. We would have to go back to America. And of course I couldn't let that happen. But I just made this plan, and of course we went in September, and winter begins in maybe the end of October. And as soon as it was winter, it was very cold. So, I had to, and one of the good things about that was then I had to find things like mitts that were warmer and socks that were warmer. And that made me go shopping, which was an experience. Anyway, I just walking around Moscow, I began to get a feel of, well, Russians and also Soviet life. But the best thing about that was that they had bookstalls on the street, and in the bookstalls they often had They had oh, you're there. They had paper books that were folk tales. Like this one.
Oh, I can't see that. What's it called?
It's called Chestnut Gray.
Ah, okay.
And that's one of my favorite stories, actually. And this one is called Daughter of the Moon and Son of the Sun. And the thing about these books is that they're they're beautifully illustrated, well translated. And my theory was that they were using writers who couldn't get published because whatever they wanted to write wasn't acceptable, and they were paying them to translate Russian folk tales, and then they were paying illustrators to do this. So because it would seem odd that that on the streets of Moscow they were selling these books in English. But it and there wouldn't be many. Maybe on a bookstall there might be 3 in English, but I began just collecting them. I have quite a few, and that opened up this whole world to me of Russian folk tales, because whatever they had I read, and then I ordered. There was a way we could order books from America. And so I ordered a good collection of Russian folktales, and I just sort of fell into them because not only I was surrounded by the Russian language, but also there were many. Well, there was the river and the Moscow River. There were old buildings that looked like buildings in traditional stories. We took a few trips. We were able to we could only go, I think it was 30 kilometers outside of Moscow. But we went to a few villages so I could see what villages look like. So I was beginning to get the landscape of the stories sort of into my head. So, and really Russia has one of the great oral traditions in these stories. And it's partly because people were ignorant, not educated, to say, up until, well, probably the Russian Revolution. I mean, I think people told stories in villages, and people like Tolstoy honored the peasantry for having these stories, So I think they had this, and plus Russia is huge. So in different places, they would have different stories. So it's one of the great oral traditions, in my opinion, of the world. And so that really helped me a lot getting through this period of time, was that I could not only read the stories, but I could begin to learn them. And I, in some subliminal way, I was hearing them because I was hearing the Russian language all the time. So I have my 2 family streams of stories, and then I have the Russian that and it's different. I mean, I know lots of stories in English, and I come from an English background, and I do identify with English stories, but it's not the same as if I had gone there, had to learn them, all that sort of thing that I have. And then the stories from my family, of course, they're from my family, so they have a meaning to me that is beyond any other kind of meaning. So those are sort of and all of those, I would, if no Russian would ever do this, but if said to me, you don't have the right to tell that story, then I could tell them why I feel I have the right to tell the story.
Okay, well, thank you, Celia. We're running out of time here. So it's really great to listen to you and hear about your storytelling traditions. And thank you to everybody who is watching this now and listening to us. See you next time.